call this meeting of the Rent Stabilization to order. Please join me for the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you. Secretary Brino, may we have a roll call?
Commissioner Kirpies. Commissioner Bergstein.
Here.
Commissioner O'Keefe. Commissioner Maggio. Commissioner Topchian. Vice Chair Gregor.
Present.
Chair Charity.
Here. Moving on to item 4, approval of the agenda. Commissioners, having reviewed tonight's agenda, do we have any changes or a motion to approve?
Move to approve. Second.
All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
All opposed? Thank you. Our agenda is approved. Moving on from item 4 to item 5, the approval of the minutes from our last meeting. Commissioners, having reviewed the minutes from our last meeting, do we have any changes or a motion to approve?
I move approval.
Second.
Thank you very much. All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
All opposed? Thank you. The minutes for our last meeting are approved. Moving on from item 5 to item 6, public comment. Do we have any public comment this evening? Thank you. Moving on from item 6 to item 7, our director's report. At this time, we'll have our report from our director, Peter Noonan.
Thank you. Good evening. So we do have one meeting remaining in this calendar year, and that's on December 13th. We have scheduled 2 appeals for that evening, and the commission has let us know that there will not be a quorum for December 27th, so that meeting is canceled. This is my report.
Thank you. Commissioners, do you have any questions before we moving on?
Just a quick one. Have you had the opportunity to speak with code compliance about that new app called Pavement that I questioned last time about tenants renting out their parking spaces, kind of like a short-term rental?
Yes, we talked about it. And as a staff group, we're looking at it with code compliance as part of the group, and there's a couple of other divisions as well. I have no information on it at this point to share. I'll provide you with an update once we have something.
Commissioners, any further comment or question? Okay, we'll move on from item 7 to item 8, commissioner comments. Commissioners, any general comments at this time? Very good. We're moving on from item 8 to item 9, new business. At this time, we'll have our report from our director, Peter Noonan. Is that correct?
Yes. Thank you. I just have a few words to say about this item. On October 15th, the City Council did review the Rent Stabilization Commission's recommendation and consideration for a pass-through of a portion of seismic retrofitting costs. The council did opt for to use the existing program that we had in the rent stabilization ordinance. That existing program only applies to masonry buildings, and so the item before you this evening does 2 things. One, it extends that program to the types of buildings that are currently in the ordinances that are in effect now. This is the soft story buildings, and it's 3 building types. The other 2 building types are the concrete, unreinforced concrete, and the pre-Northridge steel moment frame buildings. The other item on here, it does also it waives the application and appeals fees for this review, and then it readjusts the base year from 1983 to 1999. And I'm open to your questions. Staff Attorney Jonathan Holub is also here, and we can answer your questions.
Thank you. Commissioners?
I do. Yes, I have a couple questions. So just so I can understand fully, can you tell me again, you mentioned that this encompasses all 3, or I'm not understanding, I guess, what what went in front of council that is now in front of us regarding pass-through costs. I'm not quite understanding what's in front of us at all tonight.
So what is in front of you this evening is an amendment to the rent stabilization ordinance. There is an existing chapter within the ordinance that applies to masonry, unreinforced masonry buildings. And that chapter, it did use the NOI approach to rent adjustments. But what it did was it provided, and I'll read the specific phrase, beneficial evidentiary presumptions regarding the work that's done for the retrofitting. So essentially what it did was it establishes an allowance that the assumption that the costs to do the work are needed to do the work. So that's different than other aspects of NOI, where the landlord would have to provide more evidence and establish that the costs are actually needed to do the work.
Okay, so it
The
kind
other
of,
aspect is that it changes the base year calculation from 83 to 99.
yeah, before we get to the other things, just so I can understand that first part.
Yeah.
The previous, the existing ordinance, or the ordinance proposed that went in front of council, or no, the existing NOI process would make landlords provide an argument for each item that the cost was appropriate, correct? And this actually groups them together. Is this, the city's requiring this, these sorts of costs are presumed appropriate, and they don't have to provide all the backup? Is that, I mean, I don't know, I don't know what the
In summary,
beneficial,
that is correct, yes.
because the beneficial evidentiary presumptions, that's what I wasn't sure about. There was really no definition of what that meant, but that's, if I'm understanding correctly, is saying we're grouping this together and we're just going to presume that these are appropriate expenses because the city's requiring you to retrofit the building?
Yeah, in regards to the retrofitting costs, there is some amount of limitations on that based on the building permit.
Okay.
But yes, essentially, and that just applies to the cost for the retrofitting. Remember, the net operating income calculation does take into consideration all costs related to the building. This would just be that presumption is applied to the retrofitting costs.
Okay. And then on the second part, why is it that we are, I listened to the council's discussion about fee waivers and the application and field waiver. I didn't understand though why we're discussing it in this case. Can you explain a little bit more about that? The grants and application, or the application appeal fee waiver?
Yeah, this is different than what the council
That's okay.
discussed. This is embedded within the existing. So the council had actually asked about and talked about a different
Yeah,
cost
that's my
waivers
understanding as
than
well.
this.
I just want to make sure.
Yeah, this fee, it's for the upward rent adjustment application, which I believe is around $500. So it certainly doesn't come close to recapturing costs for processing. None of the fees within the rent stabilization ordinance are really intended to do that. We have the annual fee that is applied that really is it's more of the program cost recovery fee. These fees per application, they're a little more, they're nominal. However, they're still meaningful. I think a $500 fee still, that the landlord would consider that and make sure that they had an actual case that they wanted to bring forward if they're going to pay that fee. So that's the fee that would be waived. It's none of the other fees at this point.
So right now, for a landlord to apply for an increase under the NOI, they'd have to pay a $500 permit fee?
I think it's a base fee
application
and then
fee,
it's a per unit fee at cost as well. So there is a cost. I mean, certainly there's a lot of staff time that goes into processing and considering the applications.
Do you know how that compares to like City of LA? in terms of what they?
I don't exactly know how it compares. A lot of programs don't charge other fees. The programs that do charge fees, they're not full cost recovery. I mean, all of the rent stabilization programs primarily focus on the annual registration fee for the program for their cost recovery. Remember, West Hollywood, we're a little different because we're not full cost recovery for our program. Our program is embedded within the city budget. And so it's a little hard for us to compare our fees to other programs because other programs such as Santa Monica or Berkeley, for instance, those are standalone programs that are at 100% cost recovery. So any of the work done on the upward rent adjustment applications is going to have to be paid for either through the annual fee that's charged per unit or it's going to be through an application cost. We're a little different because a substantial portion of our program is actually funded through the general fund.
And because it's spread out, or we don't know how the city of Santa Monica or city of LA necessarily spreads that cost recovery out, we don't necessarily know that in the city of LA it's more or less expensive. $500 to me seemed really high. I didn't know, maybe I missed that earlier in our report for the NOI earlier this year, but I didn't realize that, and it seems really high.
No, you didn't miss it in the report from earlier this year. I don't think that we thought to disclose that, and I apologize. It wasn't it wasn't something that came across.
Yeah.
But the fee, if you honestly, the cost of processing one of these is substantially higher than $500.
Oh, no, I'm
for
not
staff
questioning
time.
that. Yeah, that was news to me, and I've sat through one of the hour-long presentations for the city of Los Angeles. They also didn't, during that presentation of NOI, mention the cost. So if I don't hear a cost, I usually think it's not really that big a deal, but now I'm hearing it's $500, so I don't know what LA is, but I just was caught off guard with that. And then the final one, how did we choose the 1999 date versus 84 or 95 or the date of purchase of the building?
So Allison and I didn't discuss this in advance of the report that went to the council, but I'm going to make the assumption that 1999 is set on the date that Costa-Hawkins took full effect.
Oh, I see.
Costa-Hawkins took full effect on January 1st of 2000.
And so how does that differ? How does that make the numbers better or worse for an individual landlord?
I don't know if it's necessarily a question of better or worse. It's a different base year. I know we had heard that the commission was uncomfortable about having a base year of 1983 because the assumption is that landlords would have that information from 1983. And I don't think that, I think there's a, I would think that we could probably hazard a guess that most landlords are not going to have their information from 1983. So it's adjusting the base year was bringing it to a year that made a little more sense in terms of a year that landlords would have the base information for. Whether it's more beneficial or not, I don't know if that's a good way to look at this, because to best understand NOI, think of it this way. You have 60% of CPI each year is your fair return. And so that's the guarantee each year you own the building. And so foreseeably, if you own the building longer, you would have a bigger adjustment from your base to your current year. But your expenses and your incomes are going to be adjusting, shifting, and changing within that time period. So I don't know if you should really think about it as being better or worse, but it's a date that is closer to present that we thought was more appropriate, because we're assuming, it's still 1999 might be, it's almost 20 years off. And so some building owners may not have that information from that year either. And another way of looking at this, you could request another base year if that is more appropriate.
I guess that's what
Or actually, I should say, I'm so sorry. What Jonathan was saying is that the landlord could request another base year.
I guess that's what my question comes down to is, why are we deciding 1999 is better than 83 versus 87 or 95, or 2005? I mean, it seems like that, I'm not necessarily asking what's better or worse for the landlord in terms of the finances, or what the numbers are going to equal at the end, but what's better or worse for the landlord to have to dig up paperwork from 1999 or 1983. I'm just not sure how we just arbitrarily chose
Well,
1999.
it's not arbitrary because, as Peter mentioned, that's the year that Costa-Hawkins came into full effect. So there's certainly a change in the return that a landlord would see starting in that year, year after year after year, when vacancy decontrol took effect, when there no longer was any control on vacant units. Also, as Peter mentioned, part of it is a convenience issue for the applicant. I think Peter mentioned that the commission and I believe the council had some concerns about the fact that 1983 would be a difficult base year to establish the gross receipts and the operating expenses for property. And that makes sense because, when the ordinance first came into effect, 1983 wasn't that far in the past. Now it's quite distant past. So it's not a scientific date necessarily in the sense that it benefits one party or the other, or it's going to create a different outcome because it's 1999, but it seems like a reasonable base year to set because it is the beginning of Costa-Hawkins, the full effect of Costa-Hawkins. It's not as far back as the original base year. And furthermore, as Peter mentioned, and this was true in the original ordinance before this recommended amendment would even take effect. If a landlord could not establish base year figures because they bought the building and all this stuff was gone, they can argue for a different base year. And I was just looking at a decision today that did exactly that. It was one of our more recent decisions, 2004, when people were still filing more of these, and the landlord could not establish a 1983 base year figure, and the hearing examiner agreed that 1988 was an appropriate year based on the information that they could provide. So, I mean, ultimately the goal is to give, the landlord has to have the opportunity to establish that they are getting a just and reasonable return. So they can provide evidence that will change things like the base year if they have to. Then that's written right into the code.
So again, I guess, so it sounds like the base year isn't that relevant if the landlord can show that they don't have documents from that year. We have to go back as far as the landlord can show documents, right?
Well, under the proposed ordinance, it would be 1999. So we would expect them to provide evidence from 1999. But if for some reason it's impossible, then the burden would be on the landlord to show why that wouldn't be an appropriate base year.
So I guess my question, we had an OI before Costa-Hawkins, correct?
Right.
So I don't understand why the Costa-Hawkins date has any significance in choosing the base date. And my question goes back to, so we know that it might be, we all agree that it's difficult to find paperwork in your documents from 1983, but I don't know necessarily if it's any more difficult to find documents from 1990 versus 1999, or I don't know how I'm not. I guess you've answered the question. You answered the question by 1999 is the date that NOI or the Costa-Hawkins took full effect.
Yeah.
And I guess I would just like to hear more reasoning on why that's a good starting point versus.
The commission could discuss and determine that a different year is appropriate, for instance, the year that the landlord bought the building. If you're looking for something with more of a rational basis on, to assure that they have the paperwork, we would assume that that the landlord has the paperwork the year that they bought the building. But certainly, this is the recommendation here. The commission can take that and change that if the commission feels that's appropriate.
Thank you.
I have a few questions, and I'm sorry, I'm still a bit new to the commission, so I'm still wrapping my head a little bit around the entire NOI process and want to make sure that I understand it correctly to begin with. So as I understand it, this is going to propose resetting the year at which they would have assumed that they were making a fair and reasonable return, and you look at their permissible income and permissible expenses, subtract the two, and then you compare them to the most recent year. That's correct, right? That's how it works?
That's the basics, yeah.
So why would we assume that they make the presumption that in 1999, whatever they were making, revenue minus expenses, was fair and reasonable? What if they were only making $50 profit?
That is a legal presumption that they can rebut. If they do not believe that they were making a fair and reasonable return in 1999, they can explain why that is not an appropriate base year. So once again, because all of this depends on the landlord recovering a just and reasonable return, if that year is not an appropriate year in their view, then they can present evidence to show that it should be a different base year.
What if they present evidence that they were never making a fair and reasonable, that there is no year that they have data for? Is that something they can do, since the heart of the question is if they're making a just and reasonable return?
Sorry, I can.
Is there, what if they were able to present evidence that they never were making, they don't have any year that they have data for, that they were making just and reasonable return? Then they still, because that's the standard, could present evidence and.
Well, they can, then presumably they would, if they were never making a just and reasonable return, well,
Maybe I can help with this.
never heard of that, but.
Yeah, because in all fairness, I mean, there's no law against making a bad real estate deal, and that happens all the time. But that's separate and apart from the NOI formula. That's really people purchase buildings for reasons, and sometimes they don't make a good negotiation, and they screw up on the purchase price based on their goals. But the NOI doesn't have any. It's not related to that. What the NOI does is it says that from year one, for instance, you are guaranteed to earn 60% of CPI on the building from that year one, or year zero, if you will. But anything before that, or a purchase price, or what they came into, doesn't really get to factor into that formula and calculation. So I think that's what you kind of where you were asking is, what if they just made a bad deal to begin with?
Yeah, I guess I also wonder, so we as a city are required to allow landlords a way to make a just and reasonable return. That's required by the courts. And I'm wondering, previously, was 1983 set because that was prior to rent control? Is that why that was assumed that they were making a just and reasonable return at that time?
What, are you asking why 1983 was chosen?
Yes.
1983 was the year before the rents were rolled back when the RSO was adopted, when the city was incorporated. So the reason for the rollback was, I think, when people learned that the city might be incorporated, when landlords learned the city might be incorporated, some of them jacked up the rents. And so 1983 would have been chosen because, landlords would have presumably have been making a just and reasonable return in 1983 before there was any bad acts of raising rents beyond market, just to kind of capture an amount before rent control took effect. I was relatively young in 1983.
Yeah.
But
that was before
that's my
rent
historical
control.
understanding of why, one of the reasons why it would have been picked. And again, even that, and this is in the ordinance, you could argue that you weren't, in fact, making a just and reasonable return in 1983. I haven't reviewed cases to see how that played out exactly.
Okay, so what I'm getting at is I wonder, does every other city with rent stabilization use the NOI process too, or is there another entire formula that some cities might use? Because what I wonder is, 1983, if that was prior to rent stabilization, there was some reason for assuming people are making a reasonable return at that point in time. 1999 is 15 years into landlords only being able to make 0.75% of the increase in the rate of inflation each year. So I'm wondering if we have a reason for assuming at that point in time. And I think at that time, rents couldn't be reset when a new person moved in too, since it was pre-Costa-Hawkins. Is that right?
We do know that Santa Monica uses the same approach of NOI. I'm not, I don't know if Jonathan's prepared to answer that. I'm not prepared to answer that for all jurisdictions with rent stabilization, but we could certainly get that information for you pretty quickly. The information that we did look at when we looked at this question of retrofitting and rehabilitation was what programs are in existence out there for those specific activities. So we didn't look at the fair return calculations in all cities. So I'd only be able to speak to the other cities in terms of what they offer in terms of rehabilitation programs and seismic retrofitting, and those are pass-through programs, not fair return.
So I realize that council's direction was just to change the date, and that's what you've brought to us, but if it was up to me, I would think it might be a good time to revisit, would this change date to 1999 with the NOI be the best way to ensure that we're doing what we're required to of allowing a means to get a just and reasonable return, or is there something that other cities are doing that makes more sense?
And if in deliberation, if the commission would like to go in that direction, that's certainly something that we could look at as staff.
Quick clarification. Peter, you said we're aware that property owners make bad deals all the time. They buy buildings at a certain price thinking that they can move all the tenants out and raise the rent, and oops, it's a rent-stabilized jurisdiction, not going to happen. But with the NOI, aren't we taking the income, the rentals that they're receiving, then backing out the expenses? So in theory, if somebody paid a certain amount for a building, their mortgage is going to be higher, their tax will be higher, that would affect the NOI, would it not?
I am not certain that we allow mortgage costs to be a factor in the NOI calculations. So we will have to check that and make sure that that's actually a part of the factors that you can roll into that equation.
I'd be curious of that, because that's generally one of the more significant costs in building ownership. Unless you've paid cash for a building, you're going to have a mortgage, and then whatever your purchase price is under Prop 13, you're paying 1% of that in your taxes. So the higher price that you pay for the building or your property tax. So I'd be curious as to if we do not
we'll
allow...
see if we can find that now. For instance, I'm pretty certain that I'm fairly certain that, for instance, for the retrofitting costs, that we don't include interest paid, so that if the building owner has to take out, I think Jonathan found it.
Yeah, mortgage and interest and principal payments are not.
Yeah, they're not a factor. They're not included in the NOI. The mortgage principal payments are not in the calculations. So I think that's also goes for any loans that would be taken out to do the retrofitting work.
You know why that's not included? Because again, that's a significant ongoing expense.
I wouldn't be able to speak to that.
Well, it really seems to be a business decision on the part of the property owner. That doesn't, the mortgage, whether they could afford it or not, was on them. Whether the rents are covering their expenses for them to be able to make a return is a different issue. I mean, there's things that are involved in the maintenance of a building that are foreseen or unforeseen. A mortgage is a choice.
I'm having trouble wrapping my head around this because it's an ongoing expense that, when I do my taxes every year, that, I declare that mortgage interest as an expense, which reduces any profit I may or may not have made on my rental property. So I'm having a hard time wrapping around what we would not include.
Well, let's bifurcate. Maybe just one thought, and I'd like to bifurcate it because I think that it's important that you look at this in terms of the cost of retrofitting and money that would be spent on that as different than purchasing the building. And tonight, what we're looking at is a program for retrofitting, and it's changing some of the assumptions for retrofitting. If someone purchases a building, hopefully they know that it's a rent-stabilized building that they're purchasing and that they consider the price and the value of that building based on on its rent rolls. And so if you come into that deal, you need to be able to come into the deal at a price that's appropriate. I think the reason why the NOI doesn't consider that initial mortgage principal and interest payment is that it's no fault to the tenant if a landlord just simply makes a bad deal on an assumption that they could get higher rents that they could otherwise charge. So they buy the building, they come in, they think they're going to just move everybody out, as you mentioned, Commissioner Bergstein, and then realize that, in fact, we have good rent protections and we have eviction protections, and no, they're in fact stuck with the rent roll that they have. So they then come in and try to raise the rents in a different way, which would be through the NOI. And I think that's why that is in the not in the NOI calculations. Now that is a different form of interest and different costs than specifically for building maintenance and for retrofitting work. So I just wanted to point that out, that perhaps there's a difference. I don't have anything else to say about it.
I think I'm more confused now. So NOI, I can't imagine that the operating expense doesn't include their mortgage. Is that what you're saying?
It does not include it right now.
So my landlord collects $2,000 a unit, 12 units. It doesn't cost him $24,000 a month to maintain the building. That'd be impossible. He would lose money every year.
I think the NOI is just about the change in the difference between the two numbers, right? So he could be having a huge amount that actually goes to the mortgage. I think you're the most out of luck if you don't have a fixed rate and the interest goes up and down, possibly, but I'm not sure.
I'm very confused. Even sure I understand NOI now.
So then if mortgage is not included in that calculation, can you just broadly explain what figures would be included in that calculation?
Sure. Operating expenses include the following: the fee for the application, which obviously will be waived in the case of a seismic retrofit. Annual registration fees, which Peter mentioned before. License fees, real property taxes, utility costs, insurance, normal repair and maintenance expenses, which include things like painting, cleaning, fumigation, landscaping, repair and replacement of all standard services, work like electrical, plumbing, carpentry, drapes, carpets, furniture, things like that. Allowable legal expenses, attorney's fees and costs associated in connection with successful good faith attempts to recover rents owing, so in other words, UD, cost recovery, and then building improvements, major repairs, replacement, and maintenance, except unless those costs are compensated by insurance proceeds. So those are the primary expenses that can be included in the operating expenses calculation. And then there's a few others besides the mortgage that are included, that can't be included, such as maintenance and repair work which resulted from intentional deferral of work, avoidable and unnecessary expense increases. That's a little vague, but the hearing examiner can sort that out depending on what the landlord presents. Penalties and interest awarded in violation of this or any other law. So essentially, if you're cited for a property standard, maintenance standards violation, then you can't put that as an expense. So that's what the law currently is.
So it sounds to me basically is that list you gave was pretty much every other expense that a landlord would normally and routinely, or if there was like, a boiler that blew up or roof, some things that don't happen on a monthly or annual basis, every single cost except for that mortgage cost. In general.
Not every single one. I mean, there's other maintenance work that might not be included.
Just in a general, from my perspective as a landlord, it sounds like that list was kind of what my normal expenses, ongoing monthly expenses are, except for any financing.
Yeah, you could look at it that way for sure.
I'll reserve any comments to when we have our deliberations.
I recall some discussion about the hardship exemption. Is that still going on or not for modifying the NOI?
There's no hardship exemption possible in NOI.
Got it. None. Okay.
I move staff's recommendation.
Yeah, and if questions are done for the director and our legal support, then we can go into deliberations. I think that was our...
I'm not sure if you were looking for a motion, but I was willing to move recommendation of staff's recommendation to the city council.
I mean, I can say here that obviously this is, born of the city council comments. Yeah, I have concerns. I mean, when you see a 12% rent increase over 12 months and another one over 12 months and then no hardship exemption, and I'm definitely going to talk to John Duran and just bring up a few of our comments today. I'm also prepared to support the recommendation just because it came directly from the comments of the city council. I don't think there's, much to talk about there in terms of, in that. However, I do think that we are tasked as citizens and as commissioners to talk to our council members about areas where we see maybe they have overlooked. So I, just in the mortgage discussion, I go both ways. I know a lot of people that have, acquired real crap mortgages at real high interest rates, and, and that's something that could flip this on its head. I'm going to talk to John about really monitoring this system and seeing if we have a ton of rent increases, on residents in our city that are 12% and then 12% the next year. I think that's concerning, and I think that we have to definitely revisit this if we see a ton of people applying under the NOI and we see lots of our, rent stabilized tenants having huge rent increases. I think that's a scary proposition. And now, obviously, we have no idea what's on the landlord's books because we've not seen them. So this is a test.
I would just add, look, I think the city's experience is that this rent increase process is so expensive and cumbersome, and it's going to yield such a small rent increase. My guess is that these changes are not going to result in a wave of rent increase applications. I just, it hasn't been an issue in the past, and I don't think any of the changes being proposed tonight are going to make it any more attractive to landlords to go through the process for the pittance of a rent increase they're going to get. So.
But I'm happy we're discussing it because I do think that we need to have some things on our brains to talk to our council members about, and I think it's a valuable discussion to have. That's all I can say.
I'm not sure that I'm ready to support the motion. I know that council wanted this to go back to them with a base year, but I do wonder just more broadly if the NOI is the best way to go about ensuring a fair return and not allowing rent increases where they're not necessary to ensure a fair return as well, because it seems like it's only based on a change from one year to another. So if a landlord started in whatever the base year is by making a huge profit, the fact that they were making a little bit smaller of a profit down the road would justify an increase. Whereas somebody else might have started out by making very little profit and then be making even less. So I just am not sure that I think it really is the best process for achieving what we're supposed to achieve. And I also don't know that 1999, makes sense for having there be a year that's in the middle of rent control to have that presumption of a fair return, because there could be some very generous landlords that just didn't bother have any rent increases for year after year, as we've seen in a couple of cases with, we've seen people that hadn't raised rents when they would have been allowed to. So I'm just not sure it's the best process, so I probably would vote no on it and prefer instead to revisit the entire thing and see if this is what makes the most sense, but I know that's not what council was looking for.
I have no issue with changing the base year to 1999. I mean, speaking from my own perspective, it would always be difficult for me to get records, and I purchased my property in 2000. I maintained my record for 7 years, which is what my accountant told. So I don't have an issue with 1999. It seems that staff has some latitude that if landlord can't prove up that particular base year, but can prove up another, that we have some discretion through the hearing examiner. I think, Commissioner Gregoire, we might be surprised in seeing more applications for NOI with the expenses of the earthquake retrofitting. It's such a out of the ordinary large expenditure for property owners to be undertaking, that whether they can get back $35 a month per unit for 10 years, I think there might be more than we can predict at this point in time that will take advantage of that. I'm not sure it would affect my vote tonight, but I think maybe at some point I'd like to discuss why the NOI doesn't include the mortgage. I can see kind of both sides of the fence where it is a relatively fixed monthly expense, but then how would you also approach a property owner who, when interest rates went down, took advantage of that and pulled out, a tremendous amount of equity so that they had cash in their pocket, but their mortgage went up. So I think there's two sides to that question, but I wouldn't mind exploring that separate and apart from tonight's motion. But I think it's worth discussing at some point.
I will definitely be voting against the recommendation this evening because as I've stated before this evening, I'm very confused. I don't fully understand what exactly that we're being asked to do other than to pass this and rubber stamp it. I don't find any reasoning or argument or logic other than I guess the logic would be that 1999 is the start, the full implementation of Costa-Hawkins, but I don't understand why that is significant in this discussion. And I haven't heard any reason why it is significant versus any other year. So I have a lot of questions about this. I don't think our role is just simply to rubber stamp what the council sends to us. The council is under no legal obligation to send this to us. So I doubt their request is that we simply rubber stamp it and send it back. I don't understand, and I think that there's either I'm very confused about what mortgage is, or I don't think we're receiving the correct information about what can be considered an NOI, because to me, you could have a 0% mortgage, and I have to pay that. That's part of my operating expense if I want to rent a building. So again, maybe I'm misunderstanding what we're talking about, but to me, mortgage is what I, as a property owner, have to pay every month to have my building to be able to offer it as a rental property. That's part of my operating expenses, and it seems impossible for anyone to have an operating expense that exceeds, if you don't include your mortgage, your rent, or your mortgage, you just be running yourself into the ground every month. There's no way you could just operate a building, or I should say, you would be making tons of money every month, I guess, if you didn't have to pay a mortgage and you were just charging everybody that much money for rent and just subtracting your operating expenses as common maintenance that has to come up. Like, that's just, it doesn't make any sense to me. I don't understand. I'm fine with waiving the fee, but I don't know why we would waive the fee on NOI applications just for earthquake stuff, or if that's even the recommendation, or if it's just a flat removing a fee for NOI applications. I don't think they should be treated any differently. there should either be a fee or no fee across the board. And so I just don't think there's enough information for me to go on to make a recommendation, because I haven't been convinced that this is better than what currently exists.
I want to raise one other point about the mortgage that I just thought about. So as I understand it, the question is the change in the delta, income minus expenses that count, not the mortgage, from one year to another. So if in year one, the person has a mortgage that they're paying, then part of that delta isn't really profit, it's really going to their mortgage. But another thing that comes into mind is if they've paid off their mortgage, then they might actually be making a lot more profit, because we wouldn't count the mortgage as part of the expenses. We act as if it's just their profit in year one, when in the year that they're asking for review, they might not have a mortgage anymore. So they might actually be making a lot more money. I think the mortgage question is complicated because, as I think Peter brought up, what if you buy a building and then you have a huge mortgage and then you say, I'm entitled to charge crazy rents because I decided to pay all this money for a mortgage. But again, that just leads me to thinking maybe there's some better way to figure this out.
I think you're right. It makes perfect sense to me, but I'm not sure how to articulate it. But I think you just did a great job articulating one of the reasons why mortgage isn't included. You know, I think in 1983, when the rents were rolled back, presumably everybody had a mortgage in place, right? Probably had a regular, it didn't go, the mortgage payments didn't go up every year. They were the same. So it seems to me it does make sense. And again, you know, if the landlord wants to like refinance and, obviously that expense will go up dramatically, and it wouldn't be fair to, it wouldn't be fair. That would be their way of circumventing the rent stabilization ordinance. As I said, it's hard to really articulate the reasoning, but intuitively it makes perfect sense to me that the mortgage isn't included.
I just had a quick question, Peter. So my question was, are we to understand this, the comments about the fee waiver, did that come about because, obviously we're not going with this pass-through, so that was looked at as a way to give the landlords a little bit of a lesser cost when you're mandating these seismic retrofit upgrades? Is that where that came out of, this fee waiver?
Yes, the council did ask us to explore other means and options, and one of them was the rent stabilization annual fee, waiving that. Another one was waiving the plan check fees and processing fees for the permits. So my sense of it from the council was that they did ask us for other options. They asked us to also explore extending the periods if in fact a building did have a high concentration of long-term tenancies, to look at extending that period for the due date of the retrofitting work itself. So they did ask us to go outside of the box and explore some things and come back to them. We do actually have that in the ordinance itself. There is extensions possible for the deadline. And then we are planning to come back to the council and let them know what those costs actually would be if in fact they wanted to waive the plan check and processing for the permits. I think that would be a fairly significant cost. And then of course we would want to disclose that if they waived the annual fee for the rent stabilization program, in fact, the city's already subsidizing the program by about $1 million a year. So that would be, we'd want to disclose fully to the council what we're actually talking about if we're talking about waiving these fees and costs, and then identify and make sure that the council has another allocation plan for that funding. So that's separate and apart from the action tonight, and this is separate and apart from the fee waiver that's within the RSO ordinance now.
You probably answered this already, but why is this coming to us tonight? Did the City Council specifically ask the Rent Stabilization Commission to review this recommendation?
Well, they didn't, but the Rent Stabilization Commission has, or commissioners on the Rent Stabilization Commission have asked nicely in the past that changes to the rent stabilization ordinance come to the commission first before going back to the council. So that's what we're doing.
So I haven't gotten a second to my motion to recommend what staff brought to us today. Does any commissioner have a alternative motion to make?
And if we could just add to that, if we could get an argument as to why the year that's chosen, 1999, versus date of purchase or something like that, some comparison so that we have some sort of idea of what we're talking about and what the implications would be.
One more friendly amendment, if we could ask staff to include both pros and cons of including mortgage costs in the calculations.
I accept all of the amendments.
I would second your motion with the amendments.
I realized I had more
So
questions about
there is a
the-
motion on the table, so Secretary Barino, we can have a roll call on that motion.
Commissioner Kerpes,
Aye.
Commissioner Bergstein,
Aye.
Commissioner O'Keefe,
Aye.
Vice Chair Gregor,
No.
Chair Charity.
No. But that's a very friendly no. No, and just to continue deliberations, and the motion passes, but I just, just to explain to my fellow commissioners, I just, maybe we missed the mark. I mean, we were really far. I mean, I think all of us were surprised to see City Council's direction with voting unanimously against pass-through. And I don't know if we're missing the mark here a bit. I just know I'm going to talk to the council member that appointed me about all of the issues that everybody brought up tonight, because I do want to report back and get some more direction from the council about, how they're thinking about things. I mean, looking at the waiver on paper, I'm super concerned that it just looks like, hey, you don't even have to pay a fee. Come apply for a rent increase. It seems like I want to make sure that we're not just having an overrun of applications and an overrun of rent increases so fast in our city, and our city changes so fast. But I also see the other side of the argument where Santa Monica hasn't had, I don't think they've had any applications or any issues with their retrofit program. And so I just see both sides, and I just feel like I need to do a bit more talking with council, so I'm a little bit more connected to their decision-making process, so we're not so off in the future.
My vote to support this was not necessarily a promise I'm going to vote for it when it comes back to us, but I definitely couldn't vote for what was in front of us tonight.
So I think we have some direction. We made a motion, and we're not going to make the recommendation. I don't think there's enough votes to make the recommendation. Staff, do you see any reason that we need to have that vote?
No.
Okay, thanks. Commissioners, do we have anything further on item 9 before moving to item 10, our ad hoc subcommittee update?
Just had one more comment that I thought of after I made my motion, that I still was a little confused about how the proposal would work in terms of if somebody is a landlord and they decide they're just going to pay out of pocket in this year for all of the earthquake retrofitting costs. Does that mean they'd get to jack up the rents by a ton or not? We can wait till the next conversation for that, or you can answer now.
Yeah, we'll roll that into the piece.
Perfect.
Okay,
We'll maybe have our other two commissioners there so they can be part of that too.
sounds good. Okay, I don't think there's anything further. So we're moving on from item 9 to item 10, ad hoc subcommittee update.
I can do just a quick, because I see David Juni out in the audience. I'm assuming he's not staying for the whole evening, and just because you're here and it's jogging my memory, I had the general manager of the Ramada Inn come into the West Hollywood Sheriff's Station asking for information on services for our homeless population. I gave him everything I had inside the station, so if I can request that we give more materials to the manager of the Ramada Inn, and when you get a chance to replenish, because we have nothing left at the station to hand out. Just jog my memory seeing you here tonight. Always good to see you. Thank you. I'm actually here for a reason.
So we'll continue with the
you go.
agenda. Item 10, ad hoc subcommittee update.
We have not met since our last meeting and our last report, but we do plan on meeting on December 13th, right before this meeting in December, and we'll have more to report then.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it. So moving on, are there any further questions or comments for item 10? So we're moving on to from item 10 to item 11, public comment. And we do have one public comment. David, if you would like to come to the mic. And please state your name and city of residence, and they'll start timing you when you begin talking.
Thank you, Commission. I'm David Juni. I'm the manager of the city's Social Services Division, and I am speaking under public comment, not to a specific agenda item. But I just wanted to come this evening and speak under public comment to bring awareness to the Commission and to the viewing public that the city is currently in the midst of the 2019 community study. The community study is basically a comprehensive, in-depth community needs assessment. The study results in updating the city's demographic report. It identifies social services needs, use and satisfaction, and we receive input on housing, public safety, mobility, economic factors, and city-to-resident communication. So I'm here to encourage you to participate. We're looking for as much participation as possible by residents. We have a series, we're in the middle of conducting a series of pop-up workshops. I'm not sure if we got this flyer to you, but it has the upcoming workshops, and there will be more in January. These go through the end of November. We also are encouraging community members, residents to get online to the city's social services page, which will direct you to the community study survey. That's for all residents at this point. This was released about a month ago, but the first phase was to get enough responses to make it statistically valid, which we did. And so now it's open to all residents. You can get on the social services page, go to the community study survey, and participate. We need to hear everybody's voices. What this does is this informs the next social services funding process, which will be coming up this spring. This is the 2019 through 22 social services process. If you recall last year, the issues that were identified that we went out with the RFP to address aging in place, HIV Zero, and the homeless initiative. So this really does, it's very tangible. What we hear from the community, we call out in the RFP, and we look for those programs. So please, if you have time, participate. And thank you for your time tonight.
Thank you very much. So just to review, the website for that is www.weho.org/community study. Thank you very much. With no further public comment, we'll move on from item 11 to item 12, commissioner comments.
I do, and I'm going to ask my fellow commissioners' indulgence. I have some remarks I've been kind of preparing for a bit. As a commissioner, I didn't think it was appropriate for me to speak out here at our meetings about Proposition 10 during the elections, but I'd like to do so now and talk a bit about affordable housing. First, let me state that I think that it is not only a right, but an entitlement for every single human being on the planet to have housing of some type at a price they can afford. That means if you live in sub-Saharan Africa and make $1 a day, or you're working for minimum wage here in this country, you are entitled to housing that you can afford. However, I don't think anyone is entitled to live in a particular building or community if they can't afford to do so. A personal case in point, back in the mid-1990s, a friend of mine's husband, COO of a multinational finance company, that company purchased a corporate home for his use up the Eastgate at Bel Air. And over the years, every time a house came up for sale next door, they bought that one too, to the point they had 17 acres and a number of homes. My friend and his husband moved into the smallest of homes, really a rundown one-bedroom 1960s ranch when the main house was torn down to build a new one, and I thought, I'd like to live up there when they move back into the main house. Now at that point, I was paying around $800 a month for my condo on Kings Road. Real estate was much cheaper back then, and I offered them $1,000 a month. They didn't rent it to me, they rented it to actor Adam Sandler for $7,000 a month. I wasn't entitled to live there at the price I could afford. I was entitled to live where I could afford. I know far too well the dire straits that people around the world, including here in California, find themselves in trying to afford housing and think that we as a society can do a much better job providing housing for everyone, no matter what their income. If we as a society want to provide national affordable housing, really which is socialism, and I know you Bernie supporters are cheering that thought on, that's another conversation. Proposition 10, to me, while perhaps well-intentioned, was a poorly written initiative by Michael Weinstein of AIDS Healthcare Foundation. While it sounded simple, ending any state rent control and returning that authority to the local jurisdictions, there were far too many unknowns. As landlords, we just had no idea of what the local jurisdictions would do and how that would affect our ability to make a living on our incomes. It is no more fair to do that than it would be for anyone who has an IRA or 401k account, or for those of you that work in the government have CalPERS, say whatever your investments earn over 2 to 3% a year, you can't have it because it's just too much. Or whatever job you have to say that your salary is so high that it causes goods and services to increase in price, you can't have that salary. It's not apples for apples by any means, but the principle still applies. As a former tenant of rent-stabilized housing and now as an owner of rent-stabilized housing, I've been in favor of the current process. Tenants are protected during their tenancies from huge or frequent increases in rent. Landlords still get to increase rent according to CPI and can then raise the rent to market rates upon vacancy, with the unit then going back under rent control. Both sides get, both sides give. To restrict your property owner's income is a really big stick to hit us over the head with no corresponding carrot. Now, in the Rooms with 12-step programs, we talk about using all the tools in our toolbox, and I think we have opportunities for far more tools to utilize. Freddie Mac has a brand new program called the Workforce Housing and Targeted Affordable Mezzanine Loan that provides low-cost financing and additional debt capital that incentivizes property owners to keep units affordable for working families while limiting rent growth over the term of the loan. I know that Councilmember Meister, during council discussions about a possible pass-through on earthquake retrofit costs, mentioned that perhaps if a property owner were to keep a unit or units, depending on the size of the building, affordable, sort of like an inclusionary unit, then the property owner could be given something in return. Maybe for every single rental unit in the state of California that is not income-based affordable housing, there could be an annual fee. I'm going to toss out $75 a year. That's just a number I'm choosing. And that money could go directly to the community that unit is located in to be used only for either buying existing housing from landlords and converting them to permanent income-based affordable units, or building new permanent income-based affordable units. The old saying of think globally, act locally applies here. I'm hoping that the overwhelming defeat of Proposition 10 won't be the end of, but merely the beginning of a much bigger, more comprehensive conversation on housing affordability. I'll be reaching out to our West Hollywood City Council members to urge that we start this conversation sooner rather than later, and that I'm happy to be involved in it. So whether you are dismayed or relieved about Proposition 10's defeat, this does not have to be the end of the discussion on affordable housing, but an opportunity for a new chapter on how we can provide affordable housing for all. Thank you.
I was just going to comment about Proposition 10 as well. I thought it was a real shame that Proposition 10 failed to pass. Look, I wouldn't support going back to vacancy control. Proposition 10, if it passed, would have allowed for that, but that's not the point of Proposition 10. The point of Proposition 10 was to give local control back to local governments, to enact reasonable rent control, to protect their residents. I would love to see a West Hollywood-style rent stabilization ordinance, in every single community in the state of California or in the United States. What we have here today works very well. It's fair to landlords, it's fair to tenants. I think it's a shame that the advertising for Proposition 10 was fear-mongering. It scared people, so people voted no. The people were deceived into voting no on Proposition 10. Look, I get that there are good faith policy arguments for and against various forms of rent control, but this was a real missed opportunity for the state of California to do something to try to protect our residents from unreasonable rent increases that the state has seen over the past 10 to 20 years. in jurisdictions that weren't as enlightened as West Hollywood to enact our rent stabilization ordinance. So yeah, it was a disappointment, and I hope the state legislature sees fit to do something, and it doesn't have to be a repeal of Costa-Hawkins, but they can amend Costa-Hawkins. They can maintain vacancy decontrol, but allow the expansion of rent control. So I hope the city will lobby Sacramento to amend Costa-Hawkins, even though a repeal of it is probably not in the cards. That's all I have to say.
Commissioners, any further comment?
I'll make a comment on that as well. I was sorry to see Prop 10 fail. I was not sure what exactly I would want to advocate that our city do if it passed. But one thing at a minimum would be nice if we could have rent stabilization apply to housing that was built more recently than 1979, the year I was born. Other things I would have struggled with, my goal is to have as much affordable housing as we can for as many people. I think building housing is key to that, and having affordable housing in every community. There shouldn't be just rich and poor neighborhoods. We should have a diversity of incomes and diversity of people in every way. So I certainly want to see everything that we can do to build more housing, and I think with the incoming governor, that's going to be a priority of his. But yeah, I was sorry to see it fail, but it would have been a struggle for me to figure out what I thought we should do next if it had passed.
I would just echo exactly what David said. I think you said it extremely well. I couldn't agree with you more. I would only add for those of you who think that Costa-Hawkins is a great idea, Costa-Hawkins was a conservative movement to punish progressive cities. The progressive cities being Oakland, Palo Alto, Santa Monica, West Hollywood, and a little town, I don't know how to pronounce Curto or something, I don't know, some other small little town. And the reason I say that it was meant to punish and to discriminate against us, the progressive cities, is because we're the only 5 cities that had, or I'm sorry, we are 5 of the cities that had rent control in place, and we were frozen in time. Any other city in this state gets to, whether through their city council or through their initiative process, gets to implement rent control similar to what we have right now, with the exception of they get to count all buildings prior to 1995, and we are stuck in 1979 or 78. I don't remember what exactly it is. But so we've got a large number of our housing stock that is just sitting there, that, and if we were any other city and we hadn't been as progressive as we were back in 1995, we would be able to count those in our rent controlled or our rent stabilized housing stock. But because we were ahead of the game back then, we lose. So I think Costa-Hawkins does need to be completely repealed. I don't think it'll happen anytime soon, but please think twice before you think that Costa-Hawkins was a good idea, because life is full of unknowns. The legislature tomorrow, if they chose to, could implement a 3% across the board maximum rental increase, and that would be perfectly constitutional. And it would apply to everybody in this state. But would it be a good fix? Probably not in some communities. Would it be necessary across the state? Probably not in many communities. But that's what life is about, unknowns. I have PERS retirement, and at any time the governor can take it away and the legislature can take it away, just as we've seen that we've found out that it is constitutional for them to do that as well this last year.
Thank you, Commissioners, for your thoughtful comments. I actually wasn't going to comment on Prop 10, but I would be the only one not to do so. So I will just divulge that I was a yes on 10, but because I feel Costa-Hawkins is a one-size-fits-all approach, and I do feel that West Hollywood is very different from other cities, very different from the city of LA, very different from Oakland, very different from other cities, and I did agree with the approach of allowing local government to determine what's best for them, and that's why I was yes on 10. I do agree that it probably was a poor poorly drafted proposition, and maybe was a little bit misinformed with the advertisements. But knowing what I know, I was yes. Just so you know. Any further commission comments? So we are moving on from item 12 to item 13, staff comments.
Just a few. I did want to emphasize, highlight, if you will, one aspect in consideration of our current rent dynamic, and certainly now that Proposition 10 has failed and we still have Costa-Hawkins and we have decontrol, that rather than witnessing some extreme rent increases through the NOI process, through a successful NOI process, what we may in fact see is higher rents and a higher average rent throughout the city related to retrofitting, was what we've seen in the analysis that we've been able to do in our database. Mind you, the database that we have right now was not envisioned to do some extreme analytical work. It was envisioned to record registrations. So we've been doing some work though, and what we've seen in the buildings that need retrofitting, they actually do come in with average rents that are on the low scale of our new rents. In fact, in 2018, some of these buildings are renting at $1,300 and $1,400 for a one-bedroom apartment. That's current rents now. That means that's moderate rents. That's HUD. HUD's moderate rent right now is about $1,383. The HCD's moderate rent is $1,818. So these rents are very affordable and realistic. And what I think we may in fact see is that what will happen is landlords will pass the cost of the retrofitting on to new tenants. And so those new rents, with decontrol in place, will spike, and we should anticipate that we'll just see higher average rents throughout the city. On Prop 10, perhaps just a thought on that, and I think that the jurisdictions will continue to advocate at Sacramento. I think one approach that I may advocate for is looking at the consumer protections that the state has in place now. Rent stabilization is it's a consumer protection program, much more than an affordable housing program, and that shouldn't be lost. The state does right now allow a 10% increase with a 30-day notice and any amount of increase with a 60-day notice. That's been on the state books for about 150 years. That's the state's consumer protection for rental properties, and perhaps that's what we need to look at changing. Vancouver, BC, British Columbia has rent control over the entire province on everything. Condos, single-family homes, new, old, you name it. And I go up to Vancouver on a regular basis. It's a vibrant city. And so you don't see these issues and concerns. You don't have people screaming and fleeing from British Columbia. And interestingly enough, in all the conversations that I went to, the discussions, the conversations, nobody mentioned British Columbia. I in fact heard people talking about rent-controlled cities in India. We didn't look to our neighbor just to the north. So I think there's a really great example for California as a state of a program that is across an entire mass area, very much similar to California. And there's no issues. Perhaps, when I mentioned it, people did say, yeah, but there's a lot of money coming in from China. Well, we can see that there's a lot of money coming into California too. In fact, I think LA Times, I didn't send the report. I don't believe I sent the article to the commission. I'm happy to do that. A lot of money that was against Prop 10 did come in from out of state. And that's a challenge. I think it's also a challenge to see some of the larger contributors to Prop 10 are also some of the major affordable housing providers. These are companies that contribute affordable housing units through using the state density bonus law and providing inclusionary units within their buildings. And so I think there's also a lot of work to be done to bridge that gap. I don't think we're going to achieve affordability in the state of California without having better partnerships between the committed jurisdictions that want rent control and want stabilized rents and realistic rents, and new developers. I just don't know exactly how we go about bridging that gap and creating those commonalities, but I think it's really a goal that we need to find some middle ground. Those are my thoughts. I don't know, Jonathan, if you have anything to add. No.
So with no further comment, we are going to adjourn this meeting until our next meeting, December 13th. If I don't see anyone, have a happy Thanksgiving. This meeting is adjourned.